for Indian Writing in English and the Women's Studies Center, Lady Brabourne College. I welcome you all to this two-day international webinar on post-colonial studies titled Postcolonialisms, Women and Current Configurations. We thank you for all the overwhelming response we've received. Nearly 900 people have registered for this event from all corners of the country and a couple of people from outside it. I hope you will all find the experience enriching and memorable. Postcolonialism, as a mode of critical thought, attempts to shift the dominant Eurocentric ways in which the relation between Western and non-Western people, or rather between former colonizers and colonized people and their worlds, are viewed. This is a long and arduous process. For all former colonies, gaining political sovereignty is merely the first step in freeing themselves of the colonial shackles. The post-colonial outlook requires a shift in perspectives, in ingrained beliefs and practices, not only for the colonizer, but also for the colonized. It demands that we learn to question all given knowledge in the light of this colonial history. Postcolonialism is thus today taught as a discipline in university departments across the world. I hope our speakers today and tomorrow will lend further clarity to this quest that is very relevant and contemporary for all of us. And now, without further ado, I request Madam Principal to give her welcome address and formally open the webinar. Madam.
Thank you, Ruchira. Respected speakers, Dr. Shobhit Bhattacharya and Dr. Purnima Bhattacharya, respected organizers, that is the Postgraduate Department of English, headed by Professor Shangjukta Das, Lady Brabourne College, and also the Women's Studies Center, headed by Dr. Parna Ghosh and Dr. Sanghita Ghosh, Lady Brabourne College. Respected participants and our very beloved students. A good afternoon and a very warm welcome to all of you. It's a wonderful occasion when the Advanced Research Center of the Postgraduate Department of English, Lady Brabourne College, in collaboration with the Women's Studies Center of the same college, has organized a two-day international webinar on post-colonialism, women and current configurations, and the webinar is being started now. Post-colonialism or post-colonial studies is an intellectual discourse that generally represents an ideological response to colonialist thought. It is the study of the cultural legacy of colonialism and imperialism, focusing on the human consequences of the control and exploitation of colonized people and their lands. Post-colonialist thinkers recognize that many of the assumptions which underlie the logic of colonialism are still active forces today. By some definitions, post-colonialism can also be seen as a continuation of colonialism, albeit through different or new relationships concerning power and the control or production of knowledge. A key goal of post-colonial studies has remained clearing space for multiple voices. This is especially true of those voices that have been previously silenced by dominant ideologies, voices of the subalterns. Space is created for the subalterns to speak for themselves in their own voices, and thus produce cultural discourses of philosophy, language, society, and economy, balancing the imbalanced us-and-them binary power relationship between the colonist and the colonial subjects. It also seeks out areas of hybridity and transculturalization. This aspect is particularly relevant during an era of globalization. Often, the term post-colonialism is taken literally to mean the period of time after colonialism. Thus, however, it creates kind of problems because the once colonized world is full of contradictions and half-finished processes of confusions and ambiguity. In other words, it is important to accept the plural nature of the word post-colonialism, as it does not simply refer to the period after the colonial era. It encompasses a wide variety of approaches, and theoreticians may not always agree on a common set of definitions. On a simple level, based on the assumption that the colonial rulers are unreliable narrators, it may seek to build a better understanding of the colonial life from the point of view of the colonized people. On a deeper level, post-colonialism examines the social and political power relationships that sustain colonialism and neo-colonialism, that is the use of economic, political, cultural, or other pressures to control or influence other countries, especially former dependencies, including the social, political, and cultural narratives surrounding the colonizer and the colonized. This approach may overlap with studies of contemporary history and may also draw examples from anthropology, historiography, political science, philosophy, sociology, and human geography. Subdisciplines of post-colonial studies examine the effects of colonial rule on feminism, literature, and theological studies, to name a few. No, I'm not going to waste much time by lingering my speech anymore. After all, post-colonialism is never my cup of tea. And to explore different aspects of post-colonialism, we have two very distinguished speakers today and tomorrow, Dr. Shaurit Bhattacharya today and Dr. Arunima Bhattacharya tomorrow. And I'm pretty certain that after their talks are over, lots and lots of questions are likely to be raised by our participants today and tomorrow. And lots and lots of their probable answers too are to be provided by both the speakers. And at the end of the webinar, I'm pretty certain that everybody will be able to know a lot more new things and a lot more new ways of explaining them regarding different aspects of this colonialism. I wish this two-day international webinar a grand success. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Principal. Before I introduce our speaker today, I would like to remind our viewers that the link to the feedback form will be provided in the chat boxes on Google Meet and YouTube towards the end of the second day, that is tomorrow. I would also like to request everyone accessing the event through Google Meet to kindly keep their cameras and microphones switched off and to not present their screens during the webinar. And now to continue. Our speaker today is Dr. Shaurit Bhattacharya, lecturer in post-colonial studies at the University of Glasgow. His research interests include post-colonial literatures, eco-criticism, translation studies, Marxism, and literary form. His works in these areas are either published or forthcoming in such journals as Ariel, Textual Practice, Interventions, Irish University Review, and in edited books such as Cambridge Critical Concepts, Magic Realism and Literature, The Aesthetics and Politics of Global Hunger, and others. His first monograph, titled Post-Colonial Modernity and the Indian Novel on Catastrophic Realism, was published by Palgrave in June 2020. His co-edited volume with Orko Chattopadhyay and Shamrat Sengupta on the radical Bengali writer Brabourne Bhattacharya will be published by Bloomsbury in September 2020. Shaurit is a founding co-editor of Shonglap, Journal of Literary and Cultural Inquiry. He will be speaking today on post-colonialism, current configurations. I now welcome him to speak.
Right. Ruchira, can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, all right. First of all, thank you so much. I would like to thank Professor Sanjukta Das, Professor Shivli Sarkar, and Ruchira Mandul, for inviting me and for today's seminar, and of course, Lady Brabourne College and the Advanced Research Centers for organizing this webinar today. And I believe that in the next few minutes, in the next half an hour or so, what I plan to do here today is to give you an understanding of what postcolonial studies as a field of study, as a field of inquiry looks like in 2020. And also, I would look forward to any queries or questions that you have. So with ideas and perspectives, at the same time with my acknowledgement of the fact that this kind of seminars and this kind of webinars allows a broader audience to engage with some of these ideas, and especially for the fact that today's seminar is mainly addressed at undergraduate and postgraduate studies. So what I would like to do is to give a bit of an understanding about how the field has come through in the last, let's say, 40 years or so, from participation or intellectual interventions by key academics or scholarly thinkers. And then in the final part of it, I would talk about what has happened in the last, let's say, 20 years or 10 years or so in the field. So this should give you, especially viewers and students and sort of aspirants interested in working in the area, some understanding about how the field has come to be and where the field is moving on from now. So thank you once again for organizing this seminar and for allowing me to sort of engage with this and engage with also, if possible, your views on my presentation as well. What I plan to do is to present through PowerPoint slides. So what I would like to show, and this is something that sometimes bugs me with webinars. Yes, just let me know. Ruchira, can you let me know when you see the screen, because I can't see anything.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, sure.
All right, because I can't see you or the screen.
Yes, you are presenting.
Okay, all right, great.
Perfect. Maybe you could present the screen, your whole screen, instead of a window, because I'm seeing a window.
Right. Just let me know if it's all right now.
Yeah, this is all right.
Okay, great. So this is something that I will be doing. So let me say that it's 12:45 here in the UK, which should be 5:15 there. And I'll take probably 30 minutes or so because I cannot see you. So if there is any problem during the presentation of these slides, could the organizer, Ruchira or somebody else, could you come and tell me through your audio rather than the video that if there is a problem, or I believe there shouldn't be a problem, and just let me know, okay? So I'll start with the first one. So these are the two things I just wanted to make sure you viewers, we are on the same page about the definition of colonial and post-colonial, right? So let me start with some basic understandings. So colonial, as you can see on your screen, is understood as a country or area under the control of another country and occupied by settlers from that country. That's the definition from Oxford English Dictionary, right? So as you can understand, so it's a control of another country by settlers from let's say an original country, right? So there are key terms coming out here, and I've sort of emboldened them with green mark: control, country, settling, right? So history and use of the term comes from the word Greek apoikia, meaning settlement. So colonialism, colony, was actually or is meant to be settlement. People far from home. That's the meaning of apoikia. That's an 8th century BC meaning, right? So it's been happening for a long time. And then in the more, let's say, current use of the term, it has come from the Latin or the Roman colonus, which means farmer tenant. That's, you can see again the dates 5th century AD onwards. I'm taking both of these from Oxford English Dictionary about the etymology of the term. As you can understand, apoikia has become more sort of obsolete or obliterated with time, and colonus has come to be taken the central meaning in our current dispensation. So colonus as farmer tenant, somebody who is moving from one place to another place, settling over there and holding some sort of a relationship with the original place that this person has come from, or let's say the farmer tenant has come from. Tenant farmer, somebody else's land I'm tilling, right? So that's the relation between, there has always been a relation between former place and new place, or let's say a master farmer and a tenant farmer. So this relationality has becoming very important in let's say colonial studies, right? So I'd also move on here from here to two kind of main terms that has come to be: exploitation colonies and settler colonies. You already understand about settler colonies, that people have settled somewhere else. Let's say in the more current meaning of the term, let's say Australia, right? Let's say Canada. This is where people have settled. Like white people have gone there and they have settled there. People from Europe, people from elsewhere, they have gone and settled. The moment you settle somewhere, that also means the displacement for, let's say, the original settlers, right? So that is the dynamics of settlement and settler colonies. And then there is an exploitation colony where people do not settle. They use that colony as more of a supply of raw resources or raw materials. In many cases, India is an exploitation colony, has been an exploitation colony by many European nations, be it France, be it Portugal, be it Netherlands, Belgium, and later on the British. So because India has been very rich mainly in the medieval, ancient to medieval period. So and rich in resources, right? So as many of you may already know, like Nil Vidroho, like the Indigo Rebellion, that is about Nil, the indigo, that's then cotton. These are things that were being sort of resourced from India to Britain for industrial revolution. So I'd not go into the history of it, but just to get a notion of the term, that what I'm coming from is that colonialism or colony is actually about settling or, let's say, exploiting a particular land for resources. And this is a definition that one of the leading post-colonial thinkers, Eleka Bummer, in her book Colonial and Post-Colonial Literature, gives, and I quote her: "The settlement of territory, the exploitation or development of resources, and the attempt to govern the indigenous inhabitants of occupied lands, often by force." So this is the key definition that comes for the term colonialism. It's a settlement, and it's also some sort of an exploitation or development of resources. Then, as you can understand, it is moved on from, let's say, the more modern meaning of the term, and these are all modern meanings of the term of European colonialism. So we can see that what is happening is later on, let's say Nil Vidroho, that once again, it's a key moment, right? The Sipai Vidroho, Sipai Mutiny, and Indigo Rebellion. This is happening like 1857, 1858, 1860, Birsa Munda, Santal Rebellion. So these are coming in the 1860s. So once again, after the settlement and a very clear torturous paradigm of colonialism, through which a particular, the particular population from Europe has settled somewhere only to exploit the resources, and by means of torturing the peasantry will come back, right, and rebel. And that for that, it doesn't need the so-called Bhadralok category, the so-called gentleman category to lead. It will rebel when it feels that it just gets into the final, it cannot go beyond, that the tortures have been so vehement. So the peasant rebellions from the 1860s onwards were the first, let's say, independence movements. In many cases, the Sipai Mutiny is understood as the first independence sort of movement. So as you can understand, colonization has seen resistance, and later on with this resistance, with the rise of, let's say, if we take India as the paradigm, or the British India as a paradigm, then the rise of Indian National Congress, moderate and extremist rebellions, leading then the rise of Gandhi and the non-violence movements, leading to independence in 1947, with also the partition of British India into, back then, India and Pakistan, and later on India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, and also the birth of, let's say, Sri Lanka. So all these territories which were part of British India, they've become like separate independent territories, right? So that's the end of the British Empire in India, at least in the post-war period, that is the 1945 World War II period, and then the rise of USA. and the rise of the USA through the Cold War and then through the sort of, let's say, commercialization of culture, the continuation of empire, because the USA happens to also use English as a global language. So it has sort of continued to have, and a lot of people say that colonialism by far, as Professor Shorkar was also saying, colonialism by far probably ended, officially speaking, with the end of empire, with the independence of India, but the methods and the structures of colonialism have continued through the rise of the USA as the superpower, and then to the rise of many other countries, because the structures of doing law or the methods of doing business have remained the same. And so this is a meaning of colonialism and post-colonial as well. As you can understand, with the final meaning of colonialism and resistance, the post-colonial came to be already, that it's a liberation, post-colonial. Before the term post-colonial became one single word, it used to be used as post-colonial, as if the hyphen was a marker of the aftermath of colonialism, which is the post-1947 for India or for Pakistan, post-1971 for Bangladesh. So or post-1947 for Bangladesh or East Pakistan, however you define sort of these terms, right? So liberation becomes like the first marker of post-colonial. Then decolonization. Of course, we'll be talking about decolonization today as well through Ngugi wa Thiong'o. What happens is you can understand that the moment there is a historical condition of self-determination, that we will now authorize and think about and determine the fate of our nation. So Jawaharlal Nehru becomes the prime minister and decides that, okay, we will have a few new institutes such as the IITs and the IIMs. We will have new universities such as, let's say, sort of JNU, or we will centralize the universities, such as all of these central universities that have come to be. These universities and the new institutes, they showcase the power, the rise of the birth of the nation, so to say, right? And the nation state formation going on as well. So there are clear boundaries being drawn. For some reason, my screen is blinking. I don't know why, but let me be with the same page, on the same page with you, that there is a boundary being drawn and a sovereignty being, boundary as in the LOC or the LAC, like some of the things that have become crucial to our understanding of nation, right? Nation state. What is India? What is Nepal? What is Pakistan? This kind of drawing of territories, right? And new ideas coming up that, okay, I am colonial, somebody else is, colonialist, I'm colonized. Whatever we do, we see that the last 3 or 4 centuries of influence, let's say, especially in education, if I'm speaking with you about a seminar or about a webinar about certain things, a research inquiry, we could also think about how they went back to the establishment of education system in the model of the West in India, right? So once we talk about native traditions, cultural traditions, rituals that do not have any influence from the British, let's say. And then we talk about this in a seminar, webinar, writing, examination, this kind of forms that have been very much influenced by Western, especially Scottish Presbyterian kind of educational system, right? So what we have today is not a complete decolonization. What we have today is, as I again have sort of emboldened the term, a co-evality, where both the things, two cultures, native and colonial, shape the way we understand, the tremendous amount of ambiguity or ambivalence that we have as we grow up. So these are the two terms which remain absolutely key to our understanding of not only the field of post-colonial studies, but also how we as individuals, subjects, subjectivities have developed ourselves over a period of time, how we respond to things, how we get into some sort of a debate, where we come from. These are the things that have shaped us, our understanding. So I'll move on here. Many of you may know him already. He's a key figure in post-colonial studies, or let's say colonial studies. So colonialism, culture, and modernity, that's the kind of relationship that has come to be, how colonialism has shaped our culture and how these two have shaped the modernity, the modern that we face. So this is what Thomas Babington Macaulay and T.B. Macaulay, again a Scottish, he wrote in Minutes, 1835, and which was published later on, Selections from Educational Records. I'll just give you a few sentences from that particular relevant ones for us today. So he says, and this first part might be something that is very familiar with you. Some of you have already done have some knowledge of colonial and post-colonial studies. So he writes, I have no knowledge of either Sanskrit or Arabic, but I have done what I could do to form a correct estimate of their value. I have never found one among them who could deny that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. You know, when I teach that in Glasgow, when I give a lecture on post-colonialism and, you know, talk about this particular quote, it becomes difficult, right? It becomes difficult because this quote is so much of arrogance. It's so much of self-aggrandizement, let's say. So much of making an aggressive claim about somebody else's culture much better than somebody, because you know, you have to also understand this is 1835, the rise of empire, the rise of Victorianism, the Victorian superiority through science and technology. Here it's not a, I mean, this is something where I couldn't talk about science in this particular topic, but this is going hand in hand with the invention of scientific technology and race-based science, comparative anatomy, especially in France and England, where people are talking about that Caucasian people are more intelligent because their brains are more developed. These are the new inventions in biological science coming out, and that is influencing the race-based thinking that Europeans are a better, superior race, more more advanced race than, let's say, the Africans or the Asians. So that's where this particular statement comes from, and this is something that we need to also always remember, that we need to contextualize them. We can't just throw them from everywhere. We have to critically engage with them, but we have to also historically contextualize them. And the second part that he writes here, and another particular quote, we must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions we govern, a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect, right? So that's precisely what I, showed to you about the coevality. This is where the coevality comes from. Now, this is particularly a very strong, the kind of, identity or the kind of approach that we have, that we are both native and Western, let's say. I mean, you are all reading, studying, doing literature. Even some of you are probably doing, advanced studies in literature and literary studies. My mother didn't do any sort of English literature or post-colonial studies, right? But she could always think about or talk about that our culture and their culture kind of a thing. Right? And how many times have you come across these terms? Now, this is not in our culture, right? So there is a very clear, predefined understanding of what stands for, so quote unquote, our culture, something that Partha Chatterjee also talks about, our modernity. Something that I'm sure like the speaker tomorrow will talk about in more at length. But the point here is that there is a concept of our and their, very much more rooted in people who have not done critical studies than in us, who are ready to engage with these sentences in a more critical contextual, prevalence. So remember that. So what he is talking about is the building of a double personality, or something that W.E.B. Du Bois calls double consciousness, right? So we are both we are being created. Here is this sentence, and this particular statement is also understood as the birth of the Bhadralok culture, so to say, as in like a gentleman that knows both their culture and our culture. So that's many scholars have also used this particular statement as the birth of the, let's say, let's say the administrative culture, right? So somebody who would, the master-slave dynamics that Homike Bhabha would talk about in many of his influential essays, right? So this is very important that we understand this part in colonial and post-colonial studies and move on from there, where things have departed from this kind of a historical understanding. Thomas Babington Macaulay, these sentences should not be read in isolation of the historical developments of scientificism, scientific racism, and the kind of comparative anatomy, and the kind of sort of cultural superiority. The concept of modernity here is so much associated with cultural superiority of the West and the East kind of relationship that was the beginning of Orientalism. So this is something that I wanted you to have an understanding, or some of you have already known, then remind you of this crucial statement, right? And then this is something that is understood as the beginnings of post-colonial literary theory. Now, this is something I wanted to show. I mean, we will be talking about Edward Said and Brabourne, etc., in brief. But this is something that I believe as the watershed of post-colonial literary theory. Not in 1978 or 1980 when Orientalism by Edward Said was published, but much before, especially in these moments. Raja Rao, who has written Kanthapura, and this is author's foreword published in 1938, right? So this is where Raja Rao is dealing with the problem of using English. Now look at it, 1938 is also a very difficult time period for India, right? A very difficult in the sense that it's a challenging time period. It is both a moment of anxiety that we don't know what is going to happen because the war is coming, and again, with the anxiety, a sense of liberation that we might now with the tremendous amount of anti-colonial nationalist movements going on, we might actually see a new India coming. So it is in this particular context that a novel such as Raja Rao's Kanthapura will be written, which will be called later on as a Gandhian novel, right? So let me say what he writes in the introduction. And the screen is doing every kind of wonders possible today. I don't know whether you were seeing this kind of blinking. I can see that. So I'm just like holding on to it, finding out if it could be possible to move on with this sort of slide presentations. So what is, because Ruchira, can you see the screen, or is it blinking on your side as well?
No, I can see the screen perfectly.
Okay, that's great, because I can't see, sometimes the screen is blinking a lot. So that's great that the viewers don't have to be undergoing the same problem. So what is happening in this particular quote is that, as you can understand, I've also emboldened this part, is that should we write English in the same way that the British have written, right? So I use the word alien, yet English is not really an alien language to us. That's what Raja Rao writes in the author's foreword, right? And I'm sure, and we have been taught this novel, and then sort of R.K. Narayan's The Guide when I was an undergraduate student. So these sentences would come back to us again and again, that it is the language of our intellectual makeup, like Sanskrit or Persian was before, but not of our emotional makeup, right? We are all instinctively bilingual, many of us writing in our own language and in English. We cannot write like the English. We should not. We cannot write only as we can write only as Indians. We have grown to look at the large world as part of us. The point here is very clear that English is not an alien language, right? Because we have been taught this language, we grew up with this language in the same way we grew up with Hindi, with the same way we grew up with, let's say, Tamil. Some of the languages we have been able to adopt, some of the languages we not. But for English, especially in a situation right now in India, especially when much of the work is done in the language of English, it becomes even more difficult or challenging to say that it's an outsider's language, right? We have Indianized English, and I don't want to go into the entire history of how writers and activists have talked about Indianizing English, but that's the 1938. Remember that's the kind of situation that Raja Rao, as in a still colonized India, is going through. That the moment he writes in English, people are actually asking him the question, why would you write in a colonizer's language? When we were talking about Gandhi's coming, write in Hindi, write in something like that in your own mother tongue or in your own native language. And that's where Raja Rao comes in, that we cannot talk about a language which has still been imposed on us as a language that is alien, in the same way that Persian is not exactly an alien language to many of us who would know Persian, or even later on who would know Urdu as well, right? So, and this is second point against English. That, and partly as again today's main focus is decolonizing the mind, right? It comes from Ngugi wa Thiong'o, a Kenyan writer and intellectual, and he's writing this collection of essays called Decolonizing the Mind, and this is happening mainly in 1958, 59 in Kenya. I think Makerere University, there was a conference where the recently famous Chinua Achebe and a number of other writers also participated about, what to think about, how to talk about post-colonial or decolonial kind of writings. And again, if I just would show you something from Chinua Achebe and his sort of intervention into why we should write in English, you would find absolutely key comparisons and close similarities between Achebe and Rajarao. So what against that comes Ngugi wa Thiong'o. So for Thiong'o, writing in English is actually not about using that language. It's about using an ideology, a culture, and everything that this language English brings to a native's mind, especially the fear, especially the torture and also the historical appropriation of somebody else's, especially the native's culture, day by day, month by month, year by year, age by age. So that's where Ngugi wa Thiong'o comes in. And again, like, this is something we need to think about here, is that, so as he says, why, we may ask, should an African writer or any writer become so obsessed by taking from his mother tongue to enrich other tongues? The question is this: we as African writers have always complained about the neo-colonial economic and political relationship, right, to Euro-America. And the moment a particular situation comes where we could actually go beyond this particular aspect, this particular situation, we have decided to bring back English. Why would we do so? If we actually talk about decolonizing the mind, decolonizing this land, what is the difference, as he writes again, between a politician who says Africa cannot do without imperialism and the writer who says Africa cannot do without European languages? So that's the key, intervention by Thiong'o, that, and what it does, what it decides to do, and I'm sure like you've been taught this particular essay in college, and you would know that what he is talking about here is that he will not write in English any longer. He wrote in absolutely fantastic novels in English, Petals of Blood, Grain of Wheat. So these kind of writings for him in the use of English are actually doing disservice to the question of decolonizing the mind, more disservice than sort of everyday using or sort of native recreational native ritualism. So that's where he decides to entirely stop writing in English and then move on to Kikyu, his native tongue. He writes entirely, and from 1970s onward, I think, from this particular collection, which when it came out, he started and he has moved on writing only in Kikyu, which he then again self-translates into English. And I don't know what is the right thing to do, whether you write in English or you're from an ideological position or whether you do not write. But I think it's a good idea at least to self-translate or to have the text translated by somebody else, so that we as global readers can also read the influential understandings, especially the absolutely key understandings in Kenyan history and colonialism that Thiong'o writes about. So I'll move on from here, and these are the key things going on in colonialism and race studies, especially if you have read this particular novel, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. This is where Marlowe says that, look, and race has been key with understanding of colonialism. The devil, as I said, race-based science, racial superiority. So this is what Marlowe says in Heart of Darkness. And I quote, "The conquest of the earth, which mostly means taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly fatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. What redeems it is idea only, the idea at the back of it, not a sentimental pretense, but an idea and an unselfish belief in the idea, something you cannot set up and bow down before and offer a sacrifice to. So basically what Marlowe in this particular novel is talking about is that what we have been doing, we Europeans, in the jungles of Congo, in the jungle, in the lands of somebody else's, what we have been doing is absolutely atrocious. The only thing that redeems us is the idea that we are doing something noble for the empire. All right, so that's the kind of understanding that Marlowe talks about, and that is precisely why Joseph Conrad is such a very ambiguous presence. He has been thrashed by Chinua Achebe as a racist writer, but at the same time, lines like statements like this also show what a kind of challenging role that Conrad had to go through while thinking about these particular things, especially in 1899, when very few people would talk about these sort of understandings or these sort of ideas of the empire. Right, the empire would come marginally in Jane Austen's and other kind of writings. So this is where Frantz Fanon, in The Wretched of the Earth, Frantz Fanon writes in 1966, the originality of the colonial context is
sorry, that. I'm very sorry to interrupt.
Right.
We had some mishaps, so your presentation to bondo hoye gechilo. If you can just start again.
Presentation to bondo hoye gechilo?
Because somebody presented their screen. So sorry.
So where could you just tell me exactly?
Yeah,
so
apparently the tech resource person is telling me that you will have to just present your screen, like stop presenting and start presenting again.
Okay, no problem.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
So no problem. These are things that are going to happen, no problem at all. So what I'll do is I have stopped presenting, and then what I'll do is I'll present again.
Yes, that's what he told me.
Can you see my screen now?
Now yes, you're presenting.
Yeah, that's great. So I think you'll be able to see, right. Can you see? Can you once confirm if the screen is visible? My PowerPoint slides are visible on your screen.
Yeah, your slide is visible.
Yeah,
we are on this slide with the heading, The Beginnings of Postcolonial Literary Theory. That's slide.
That's great. That's great. Thank you so much. So what I'll do is, because of time also, I'll move on with some of these ideas. And thank you so much for giving me this heads up, because I probably finished my presentation and then got to know that this was not being shown. So the point here, I mean, just if viewers have not been able to see this particular part, the point here is that should we use English as our own language? This is the tension that is going on in Raja Rao's Author's Foreword in 1938, and this is where in 1960s, the book was published much later, 1987, but in the 1960s and 70s, this is what is going on in Ngugi wa Thiong'o, that if we want to decolonize our land, our culture, our understanding, our mind, right, the psychology, then we need to stop using English as a language, right? So I'm just like, once again, just very quickly repeat these sentences in green bold. Why, we may ask, should an African writer or any writer become so obsessed by taking from his mother tongue to enrich other tongues, right? And then the second part, what is the difference between a politician who says Africa cannot do without imperialism and the writer who says Africa cannot do without European languages? Very clearly here, Ngugi wa Thiong'o is taking a very ideological position that I will not write in my colonizer's language and then say that I want my land to be decolonized. In order for that to happen, I need to first decolonize the mind, and to start it, I need to write in my own tongue. Okay, this has been a difficult proposition. It is not entirely without its criticisms, but Ngugi wa Thiong'o has continued to not write in English and write in Kikuyu, his native language, and then sort of translate them into English, or have them translated into English so that global leaders can also read. right? So this is the kind of proposition I'm talking about, for English against English. That's the beginnings of post-colonial literary theory. And I was talking about here race and how race has been formative for colonialism, and we have seen this in previously as well in the 1835 Macaulay's understanding about how English or European shelf or literary language is better. This is where Marlowe is saying that the conquest of the earth, which mostly means taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. What redeems it is the idea only. So basically, colonialism is about torturing people in different parts of the world. What redeems is the idea that we are doing something noble for the empire, for the queen, etc. And this is what Frantz Fanon writes, that the nature of the earth, that the cause, and again, the green part, the cause is the consequence. You are rich because you are white. You are white because you are rich. So this kind of relationship between race and economics, race and commercialization, is something that has been the beginning of post-colonial theory. And I'll move a little quickly here from here onward with some of the key contributions by post-colonial thinkers. And here, why do I want you to remind this part if you already know? Because initially I thought, because it's a student-oriented discussion, so I'd remind you that some of the key interventions by key people, right, in post-colonial literary fields. So this is from colonial discourse analysis to post-colonial theory as a field. So the key concept here is the Orient, right? And again, I'll be quick here with what Edward Said wrote in Orientalism. So again, just follow the green parts, right? Under the general heading of the Orient, so there emerged a complex Orient suitable for study in the academy, for display in the museum, for reconstruction in the colonial office, for theoretical illustration in anthropological, biological, linguistic, racial, and historical theses. So the birth of the Orient or the colonized subject from the 18th century discourses of empire is the beginning of the understanding of the Orient by the West, that the Orient is something like this, and the Oriental is something like this. The Orient needs to be studied, needs to be displayed in a museum, needs to be reconstructed in a colonial office, needs to be studied. Then again, in another book, Culture and Imperialism, what he writes, Edward Said, 1993, that in this particular, all the works argue, and here he's talking about Jane Austen, he's talking about, Charles Dickens, key Victorian writers, argue that the source of the world's significant action and life is in the West, whose representatives seem at liberty to visit their fantasies and philanthropies upon a mind-deadened third world. In this view, the outlying regions of the world have no life, history, or culture to speak of, no independence or integrity worth representing without the West. And where there is something to be described, it is, following Conrad, unutterably corrupt, degenerate, irredeemable. So this is the concept of the East, or the, let's say, colonized territories, the outlying regions of the world that come to be represented in the concepts or the practices or the discourses of the Orientalist, right? And this is the kind of response again from Homi Bhabha. Again, colonial discourse analysis. This is known mostly as colonial discourse analysis. That the two key terms, and I'm going to be very quick here, two key terms coming out from Homi Bhabha's understanding is mimicry, right? That the master did not dominate the slave. Let's say if we follow the Hegelian master-slave dialectic, the slave imitated the master. And the key, for me, the key example would be Shakespeare's The Tempest, right? Where Prospero's words and practices were mimicked by Caliban, who says that I have now learned your language and I know how to curse in your language, right? So this kind of mimicry and hybridity will be long markers in colonial discourse analysis, from mimicry to indeterminacy, surveillance, etc., which will be key in colonial discourse analysis. And from there also, these are all happening in the 1980s. The field of post-colonial literary studies is slowly being born in these writers and in these interventions, where Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, as you can see on the screen now, with her absolutely influential essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, will ask a very important question not only about can the subaltern speak. The point here is that if you can also notice the green parts, clearly, if you are poor, black, and female, you get it in three ways. Between patriarchy and imperialism, subject constitution and object formation, the figure of the woman disappears. Not into a pristine nothingness, but into a violent shuttling, which is the displaced figuration of the third woman. And the final part, again, the emergent dissenting possibilities of that hegemonic account of the fighting mother are well documented and popularly well remembered through the discourse of the male leaders and participants in the independence movement. The subaltern as female cannot be heard or read. These are like, as you can understand, these are like very important interventions in colonial discourse analysis, that there is a subaltern, which is in a very Gramscian sense, a military rank under somebody else, like another rank, and then there is a female subaltern, right, who is always appropriated, whose ideas and voice is being appropriated throughout in the Indian independence movement by the male leaders. That's an intervention that that's also the beginning of post-colonial gender studies. So this is more with the Empire Strikes Back in 1989. Post-colonial studies as an academic discipline is born. To move on here with three key developments in the last 20 years or so, right? So one of them is post-colonial studies and world literature. Here I begin with the understanding that you already know or have already understood that race and gender and class, these three things have been key to the development of post-colonial studies as a field. As Professor Shorkar was also saying, this is not only about literature, it was also about history, political science, sociology, anthropology, in close dialogue with these fields that post-colonial studies as a field was born. So as I showed, race, gender, and class, these are key components. Beyond that, what is coming up in post-colonial studies? There has been a dialogue between post-colonial studies and world literature. And the dialogue, as one of the critics, Neil Lazarus, in the book The Postcolonial Unconscious, says that it would be more accurate to maintain that postcolonial studies, in its prevailing and consolidated aspect, at least, has been premised on a distinctive and conjuncturally determined set of assumptions, concepts, theories, and methods that have not only not been adequate to their putative object, the post-colonial world, but have served fairly systematically to mystify it, which means that there is a post-colonial world, a world that we live in, a world that we have seen every day on a daily basis. And this is a key, I mean, as you can understand, this is such a frank sort of dismissal or frank confession that look at about, I mean, when I was reading post-colonial studies in Jadavpur University, I was probably have to board a local train and go elsewhere and look at our life, right? And this is what we live on a daily basis in a post-colonial world. And look at the theory that talks about a number of important things which are not at all, not any less important, right? Mimicry, hybridity, subaltern, Orientalism, all these concepts that have come to be. But how do we implement this concept? How do we see these concepts in our daily world? When we are boarding these trains, we are going somewhere else. When we are sort of, saying something to our mate, right? The relationship, the social relationships, the kind of economic relationships. Do we see these terms having any purchase in the world that we live in? This is where it becomes increasingly more difficult to talk about certain terms and not, there is always this tendency to abstract, to reify certain terms in the current world, which when you are asked, whether there is a relationship between this term and the post-colonial world we live in, sometimes we'd be at our wit's end to sort of, implement that kind of relationship. So Neil Lazarus is talking about that at least in these 3 or 4 ideas or dimensions we can think about in post-colonialism is that class relations, land and environment, state and nation, and structures of feeling. And then, as you can, I'm not going to be reading these parts at all because of time. But the point I wanted to make here is that post-colonial studies and world literature have become very contentious fields throughout. That one of them would say that post-colonial studies is important, somebody else would say no, world literature is important. And there is a very strong, again, a Marxist and let's say a language-oriented, textual-oriented. I'm not going to be under sort of in any way oversimplifying that this is a Marxist and this is a post-structuralist, but the contentions are more about, let's say, language and more about the world that we live in, social relationships. So these are some of the new ideas that have come out. Okay, so the final two slides, or the final two developments, will be one about post-colonial ecologies, right? And this is what Pablo Mukherjee, in an article in 2006 about Amitav Ghosh, writes. And this is something I want you to remember. And this is something also that I also work in. So I want you to also remember how these two fields have come together, post-colonial studies and environmental studies. Surely, any field purporting to theorize the global conditions of colonialism and imperialism, let us call it post-colonial studies, cannot but consider the complex interplay of environmental categories such as water, land, energy, habitat, migration, with political or cultural categories such as state, society, conflict, literature, theatre, visual arts. Equally, any field purporting to attach interpretive importance to environment, let's call it eco-environmental studies, must be able to trace the social, historical, and material coordinates of categories, right, such as forests, rivers, bioregions, and species. Point here that Pablo Mukherjee makes is that it is impossible to talk about colonialism without talking about the environment that they shaped. And this is something that that has come in a more focused manner in the book Post-Colonial Eco-Criticism in 2009. And where Graham Huggan and Helen Tiffin, they give us the introduction that not only were other people often regarded as part of nature and thus treated instrumentally as animals, but also they were forced or co-opted over time into Western views of the environment, thereby rendering cultural and environmental restitution difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. Once invasion and settlement had been accomplished, or at least once administrative structures had been set up, the environmental impacts of Western attitudes to human beings in the world were facilitated or reinforced by the deliberate or accidental transport of animals, plants, and peoples throughout the European empires, instigating widespread ecosystem change under conspicuously unequal power regimes. The point here again by Mukherjee and by Huggan and Tiffin, that colonialism has radically reshaped the world precisely because, as I said, colony or colonization were exploitation colonies were like resource colonies, right? You draw resources from here. Look at the famines that we have in the last 2 centuries in Bengal and in India. Most of these famines, social scientists would say, had to do with radically changing agricultural forms by implanting cash crops such as cotton or, let's say, indigo, and replacing the food crops such as, let's say, rice or wheat. And when you have a famine, when you have a hunger condition going on, you can't eat cotton or indigo, right? So many of these famines were historically manufactured, something that would be known as man-made famines, right? It's rather better term would be European-made famines, right? So these are things to think about, that how colonialism and environment was has constituted each other. And finally, this particular development I'd like to talk about is decolonizing the university or the curriculum, right? So decolonizing the university or the curriculum is something that that has been in the last few years, that has been also been part of various activism and sloganeering and slogan movements. And here I'm talking about not only the West, I'm talking about some of the, again, this is not something which has developed in the West in the same way colonialism and environmental studies have not developed in the West. It was Ramachandra Guha and Martinez Elias' book on environmentalism of the poor, that is in the 1980s and 90s, is when post-colonialism and environmental studies were being taught together. In the same way, decolonizing the university, these slogans were being developed in South Africa with the particular movement, student movement called Rhodes Must Fall. Rhodes, as Cecil Rhodes, the industrialist and the philanthropist. The Rhodes statue must fall. That the statue reminds us that he is beyond the noblesse that he had was an atrocious human being, right? So this statue in no way shows what we are today. So that's where the statue and the statue must fall kind of a movement had begun, especially in South Africa and then later on in other colonial parts as well. And then in Oxford, where there is a Cecil Rhodes statue in, I think, Oriel College. So this is what Priyangvada Gopal, who is a professor of English literature at Cambridge University, and also has written a very important book, I think, in post-colonial studies for the recent work is called Insurgent Empire. So this is what Priya Gopal writes in a newspaper article in 2017, that yes, we must decolonize. Our teaching has to go beyond elite white men. So this is what she writes: to decolonize and not just diversify curriculums is to recognize that knowledge is inevitably marked by power relations. In a society still shaped by a long colonial history in which straight white upper class men are at the top of the social order, most disciplines give disproportionate prominence to the experiences, concerns, and achievements of this one group. Yet, decolonization is not just about bringing in minority texts, but also how we read traditional texts. Our students have rightly asked to know more about the colonial context in which much English literature was produced, indeed, in which the very idea of English literature came to be. And if you remember, the idea of English literature came to be. This goes far, just straight back to Macaulay's concept of what English language education should be in the colonies, right? And if you know it, I don't know how many of you know it, it is in the colleges in Bengal, such as Presidency College, later on, I'm sure in Bethune and Lady Brabourne College, in the colleges of Empire is what English literature as a subject was studied, as a particular field of study was first carried out, not in universities in Britain. Much later, English as a language or as a literary field started to be taught in Britain much later in the late 19th or early 20th century, especially in Cambridge. It probably started in 1912 or 13, and in Presidency it was started in 1850s. So this is something that I want to think, that the very idea of English came to be in the colonies, and yet the metropolitan audience doesn't know anything about it. And it's very weird that nothing of any importance in the colonies is taught in the metropolitan schools, other than the fact that they have given us the ex-colonized people, the railways, the English education and the law. Everything good is taught, not the challenges that they had to face with. So that's what Priya Gopal is asking here. And that's exactly how decolonizing university kind of curriculum movements have looked like decolonized education, roads must fall. And that's the book that has come out recently called Decolonizing the University. I would like to stop here with this final bit, that it's not about post-colonial studies, is not about the metropolis. It's about the post-colonial audience. That's the question that we're talking about in Neil Lazarus's voice, that post-colonial studies has mystified post-colonial world, that it talks always about the center. It talks about decentering the center, but it inevitably talks about the metropolitan center. Where is the post-colonial world in these discussions? If we think about that, it is all about Oxford, decolonizing English. It's all about Britain and US, that Black Lives Matter or something like that is always an alien concept, that we are wrong. This is our job in the post-colonial world to think about how these concepts actually impact us, right? About how concepts of gender, concepts of caste, and concepts of educational privilege continue to haunt a whole generation, continue to shape a whole generation. So why is my curriculum white could be a slogan in Britain or USA, or where the majority is white. I would always ask, why is my curriculum Brahminical in India? Why are the writers always coming from the upper caste in India? Why is writing itself so much casteized, right? Why is writing so much gendered? Not only upper caste, but male. These questions is not that they have not been asked. I started reading literature, Indian literature, in 2007 in Presidency College, when there was an optional course called Indian Writings in English, which means that already we have started asking these questions in undergraduate curriculum and education. And I'm sure in the last 13 years or so, we have broadened it, brought in more ideas, etc. And I'm very glad to see that Lady Brabourne has already got its advanced research centers in Indian English writing and gender studies. So we have been doing this expansions of literature and continuously asking questions. And this is precisely what post-colonial studies as a field, or in its current configuration, asks us to do, to continuously question the current dispensations and to challenge the privileges that unconsciously shape our understandings and ideologies. So with this, I'd like to thank and stop sharing the screen.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Shobrit Bhattacharya. Thank you very much for this extremely insightful paper. And I'm sure your deliberations will help the participants to put into perspectives not only the key concepts of postcolonial studies, but also the current configurations that you have put here in your presentations and very well presented paper. Now, as always, we will proceed to a very short interactive session, interactive session of question and answer. I have already some questions in the chat box, and I'll be reading out the questions to you. And I will ask you to please give your response. Dr. Bhattacharya, shall I read them out?
Yes, of course. Please go on. Thank you.
Yes. The first question is, are the terms colonial and post-colonial eternal or time-based? If time-based, for how much time they are applied? If eternal, can England, France, etc., can be called as colonies?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question to start with. Thank you so much. So I'm just writing the question so that I don't forget. So what I gather is that the question is if they have a temporal value, right? This particular term, colonial and post-colonial.
Whether it is time-based or eternal.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So what I mean to say, my understanding of this particular question or the response would be that colonial is, as you understand, can go back, let's say 8th century BCE. The point is not whether we're talking about the etymological understanding of the term. The point is, I'm sure, like the the participant also knows and has come from this particular idea that we're not talking about Greek or Rome, that kind of temporal value. We're talking about the contemporary value, right? And to me, colonial and post-colonial, these are not, of course, timeless terms. And I'm not too sure even that the Mughals actually used those terms. I'm not even sure if the Guptas actually used those terms, right? They probably talk more about settlerism, that people have settled somewhere, settlers, etc., or invaders, right? Colony is a very historically temporal term. Colony came to be known as a more important value-oriented term by the Europeans because they wanted, as I said, in many cases, they did not settle in those territories. They wanted those places to impose a form of learning because it was easier for them to transact with that particular. And India is not Sri Lanka like a tiny, at least in the British sense of it, like a tiny island. It's a huge territory, right? And a huge territory of multiple cultures and languages. How do you bring them together and then do those transactions, be it linguistic or commercial? So that's where the concept of colony came to be born. So to answer your second question is whether they could be, I mean, if we could move beyond these terms and if we could see the centers, colonies, I'm very sure that England was known as a colony of the Romans. So when they talk about when France talk about colonies, as you can understand, their literature, their culture is all about the Greek and Roman empires and colonies. They always sort of, in a sense, hark back to them in a nostalgic sense that, that was the Greek empire, that was the Roman empire. And look at it like, Aristotle, that's our culture. Look at it, right? These Doric pillars, these are our cultures. So there is always this nostalgic harking back that we have been colonies, now we have become metropoles. In the same way for post-colonial countries, there is, in a sense, a very ambiguous nostalgia for empire. Wow, look at, we will make Kolkata London. So where does this particular thing come from, right? This comes from this desire that London was much better. And that comes from also the ignorance of the fact that how colonies, how particular ideas, cultures, and languages have been shaped by directly shaped by certain thinkers and certain ideologies. So that's what we need to continuously, I think, interrogate all the time, that whether we look forward to making some other places colonies or whether we look forward to disentangle us from this particular ideology. That's precisely where Ngogi wa Thiong'o's decolonizing the mind is such a challenge.
Yes, right. Yes, decolonizing the mind. That is the point,
Yes.
actually, that we have come to. Shall we move to the second question then?
Yes, please.
It is, the question is that Spivak talks about two ways of representation in her essay, Vatrutrang and Darstelang. Are these two forms of representation only political, or do they apply to a way of representation in general?
Right. So thank you so much for this question. I believe that this, I do not know German, but I believe I remember this particular sort of section of the essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? I think one is political symbolic representation, one is symbolic representation. Now, political representation comes from the fact that the subaltern, let's say electoral representation, right? So if you see that certain bodies have not been represented widely electorally, there will be a push by the government to represent them by bringing some of the members of this particular group into the electoral body, such as maybe like giving them a MLA post, or so that they become the voice of the people and the groups that they represent. Now, this is a more of a political representation. The more difficult part is a symbolic representation. I think both for Spivak and for many of us, that symbolic representation, both of them, political and symbolic representation, have the risk of being co-opted and appropriated by the people who represent or who ask them to be represented. So very often you would realize that everybody wants to change the world, but the moment some people decide to take this mantle to become the MLA and MP, we have a natural tendency to not to trust them all the time, precisely because we believe that they are also being co-opted and they will probably think of their own interest more than the interest of the people. So this is where I thought political and symbolic representation are both together and yet very difficult to not being appropriated. And this is where I think Spivak also talked about how Bhuvaneshwari Bhaduri, the diary that she wrote in Can the Subaltern Speak, the diary was a symbolic representation of what could not be done. And the diary was then appropriated and made into a representation of the female by the male. Continues to be always the representation by the male of the female. So this is something where I believe that it's very difficult to go away from. The moment you go into the representational politics, it's very difficult to, again, to go back and talk about today's main key topic, decolonizing the minds. Once you are into an education, cultural and ideological system, which has been imposed on you without your saying yes or no, it's very difficult to decolonize in its etymological sense. But I think Ngugi wa Thiong'o also knew that to decolonize or to disentangle these political and symbolic representations, one needs to always be aware of the fact that they are with us. And this is a constant interrogation of our mind and body, that we know that it lives with us, this colonial culture, but at the same time we are aware of the colonial culture, and all we could do is to challenge that culture in our conscious decisions and practices. That's where I think the two representations, political and symbolic, are challenging.
Thank you so much. There is another, many questions actually, but this one is quite interesting. I am just reading it out. I was reminded, this is an observation, and there are two connected questions to it. I was reminded by the concept of violent hierarchy, and as Derrida said, there will be a hierarchy, subaltern and subaltern. It is the latter that decides who subaltern will be. The question one is there is a subliminal presence of the concept of othering here? And the second question is, what can this concept of subaltern and superaltern be applied to gender hierarchy?
Right. Thank you. I've just written these questions down to sort of, respond within time. So the first question about subliminal othering, I believe for me, as a critic, as somebody who practices ideas relating with post-colonial, let's say, or decolonizing language or literature or cultures, I believe terms such as subliminal or something which is liminal is a difficult proposition to make it's not to dismantle the term that we have liminal personalities, we have absolutely sort of subliminal personalities as well. But the problem comes here is when you start politicizing your own position, right? If you want to talk about people and literatures that have been co-opted and that needs to be recuperated, the first job for to me is to talk about those literatures rather than to talk about the subtleties of power relations within those literatures, right? If there is no manto, if there is no sort of, let's say, Ismat Chugtai, if the literature, the Urdu literature does not exist in our imaginary, then we cannot talk about the subtle power relations between Urdu and Hindi without going first through Manto and Ismat Chugtai, without especially asking our readers to understand what they wrote about. For me, the first job, and this is something that we have not been able to do, the first job is to grab the terms, and this could be the second wave of post-colonial studies, to grab these terms, othering, subliminal, subaltern, mimicry, all these terms, and then to implement them in your current world, in your current life, in your current society. If you find it difficult to implement them, that doesn't mean that those terms do not make any sense. That means that we need further terms, right? So that's precisely what I thought, that the subliminal othering that you talk about is something that we understand as a human being, that I'm othering somebody, or consciously or unconsciously, by the chosen language or the chosen culture. But can I also find another term for what I do that then I could use in my studies, in my language, in my studies, which doesn't need a Bhaba or a Spivak or a Shorit Bhattacharya to tell me what it is, right? So this is something I believe we need to think about again, about terms. And that's precisely why I went back to colonial and post-colonial, give you a speech, term like step by step, holding on to these terms, which need to be always made open to discussions. About subaltern and subaltern, I also believe that these are two different terms to talk about, again, power relations, right? It's a very interesting thing when we talk about super, sub and super. If you remember, even Word doc has superscript and subscript, right? So who is going to be on top, who is going to be beneath, and if the person on top is actually the master and the one beneath or below is not a master, or it's like more of a slave, in a very gendered manner of speaking, it's also about what we have chosen to see. And post-colonial studies exactly asks us to do the difficult task of undoing or unchoosing to see, unlearning what we have been taught to see. So to me, again, do you think that your social relationship with people allows you to choose that person as a subaltern, or a gendered subaltern, or let's say lower caste or upper caste? How do we see some people through the markers, caste, gender, race, is precisely what post-colonial studies asks us to do. And it's a difficult task, as I say, to do it in a more everyday social life. I can always say that I do it because I'm a literary critic, I'm writing about all these problems, and I know about them because I have read them vicariously through literature. But when it comes to practice it in a daily life, and that is the difficulty with feminism, Marxism, post-colonialism, all these kind of theories, which are not only about literary studies, which are about practicing them on a daily basis. And that's the problem that comes in. And this is where I believe, terms such as subaltern needs to be thought about again. Like whether it does make any sense for my own understanding. Could I go with the term peasant? Could I go with the term Dalit? Could I go with the term victim? Could I go with the term oppressed? Does the term already give me the edge that I don't need another term, subaltern, to bring? Or do we need a new term such as migrant? Does the term migrant mean something in India and something in Syria? These are things we need to ask again and again, I believe, in post-colonial studies. The migrant in India is very different from the migrant in Europe, right? So these are the migrant born of forced migration is very different from the migrant born of professional opportunity. These are things we need to go back again and again, I believe. And that's precisely where post-colonial studies needs to be recuperated, according to me, that it has become much more tied with a huge amount of terms, which sometimes become replete, sometimes become abstract, without emptied of any value or any sort of content.
Very adequately answered. Now, another question is post-colonialism a condition or a state of mind or only a literary theory? Can we employ it in analyzing two different texts written before and after independence? Would our basic presumptions change in case of the two works? How to analyze a colonial text through post-colonial lens? Quite involved questions are there. Quite a number of involved questions are there. Yes.
Right. Yeah, that's
Like
great. Thank you so much. I'll respond to this one. So, yes, as I probably, whoever asked this question probably already got maybe a hint of an answer that post-colonial, in the previous response, is that post-colonial studies is both a worldview, the way we live the world. It's not only a worldview, a life practice, the way we live our everyday life. As I said, if we were doing, let's say, Monosha Puja or something like that, which didn't have to have colonialism to remind us that there is a Monosha Puja, and you were also doing, let's say, school education in an English Western education system, right? Or even Pathshala and education system, they too have shaped us in the way that we live today in 2020, the way we live today, that probably we have to talk about post-colonial thing and decolonization and then go back and help my parents or my family to organize a puja or a parban or a ritual. Things like, any kind of ritual, right? So the point here is that I believe that post-colonialism was first, and if you read people work by Frantz Fanon or work by Neil Lazarus, or much before work by, as I said, Raja Rao or Bhagat Singh, you would see the antecedents to post-colonial theory already taking shape in some of these writings. And these writers were actually activists, anti-colonial nationalists. They were sort of, like revolutionaries. In their writings was post-colonialism born. And what we have is also theory shaped by actual living conditions. So post-colonialism to me is always first a living condition from which a theory for literary studies was developed through colonial discourse analysis, as I showed to you. Second part of the question is about reading a text before 1947, let's say, and after 1947, right? So before 1947, let's say Raja Rao, again, I gave you the example, Raja Rao's Kanthapura, the Arrival novel, the Mahatma novel, and let's say, 1980s, Midnight's Children, 1980, or maybe like, before that, let's say Anita Desai's novels, right? And much later, let's say Arundhati Roy, The God of Small Things. Now, these two novels could be read together, of course, need to be read together depending on what the reader wants, but they need to be also, as I said in the beginning, historically contextualized. Arundhati Roy did not write in the 1940s or in the 1930s when India was going through a tremendously turbulent time period with the Second World War, famine, food crisis, naval mutiny, riots, so much going on. That not to say that these things are not happening today, but it is not to conflate 1940s with 1990s, right? 1990s, we were all, at least me, I was born in a post-independent India, and my values were shaped by the values that post-independent India had showed to me, had bestowed upon me. I could not compare it with the values of my father, who was born in the 1940s and had to see as a child some horrible time periods in the 40s, especially for people who were in Bengal, right, with riot, famine, partition, etc. So to me, you can always bring them together, but never forget the historical conditions within which they were born and which they want to shape. And these conditions shape the conditions of the author as well as a literary critique.
Yes, and I think there is though there are many questions, but I would only like to ask only one question, which I think will be interesting. It is this one.
Right.
Does decolonization of university has any negative impact on development?
Right.
Would you like to take this?
Absolutely. And sorry, there is some sort of a digging or drilling going on outside of my flat, so there might be a bit of a noise. Sorry for that. So it's a very important question again, decolonizing the university and development. To answer that, I would say that development as a model needs to take into account this cause. That it has not taken into account this cause is a problem in itself. You cannot talk about the development of a country such as India, which has seen 3 or 4 centuries of colonialism, etc., at least European colonialism, or much before that, invasions, settlements, different cultures. This is how we have come to be, right? If we talk about, as to the first question I said, if we talk about only colonialism and post-colonialism, these terms, that we are trying to say that modern India is all about colonialism, is all about the British. Modern India is also about the caves and the cave paintings as well, which was a beacon to the entire world that this could be done, right? The kind of things that we know India for, the immense power in architecture and sculpture and painting that India has shown over the years, over centuries, over millennia. So the point being that if today we talk about development of building bridges, building roads, commercializing our cultures with, commercing with, let's say, modern day Britain or USA or Japan or China, etc. We cannot forget the fact that this goes back 500 years before, 1,000 years before. India had already commerced with these lands and entities and cultures. And India was not only commercing with them or trading with them, but both of them were shaping each other's cultures. That's precisely why Rabindranath Tagore would decide to go to China, Iran, Japan, Argentina, everywhere, because he knew that a Pan-Asianism was already there in Indian cultures. So that's the thing I'm talking about, that if the development model of today's, which is more like a neoliberal model, completely forgetful of what went before, if it doesn't take into account the cultures and the histories that we are a consequence of, then that's a flawed model. And that's precisely where I believe that it should not be a development model which feels that decolonizing is a hindrance, should not be so for a post-colonial nation such as India.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Shobhit Bhattacharya, for your excellent paper and this very engaging and interesting, question and answer session that we had. With this, we come to the end of today's program. I thank you on behalf of all the organizers, on behalf of the organizers. Tomorrow we meet again at 5 p.m. IST for the day 2 of this international webinar. Our distinguished speaker for tomorrow is Dr. Arunima Bhattacharya. She is IASH Fellow, University of Edinburgh, also Research Associate on AHRC-funded project, The Outsider from Within, Indian Anthropologists and the Birth of the Nation, School of History, University of Leeds. Our topic for tomorrow is Women, Nation and Colonial Modernity in Partha Chatterjee's The Nation and its Fragments. We look forward to another interesting session tomorrow at 5 p.m. IST, but remember to log in early. Till then, goodbye and have a very good evening. Thank you all for participating today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for organizing this, and I wish you the best for tomorrow's endeavor as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.